Hi, I'm Dr. Disha Spath. I'm a practicing internal medicine physician and the founder of the Frugal Physician. I'm passionate about teaching physicians how to get their financial houses in order so that they can design their ideal lives. Part of, and the most critical portion of designing our ideal lives and getting our financial house in order is getting adequate disability insurance in place. We're lucky to be here live with Dr. Pearson today to discuss this very important issue. Dr. Pearson is a board-certified OBGYN and a disability insurance broker. She herself went through the disability claim process after precipitous delivery caused her to have a shoulder injury. And she's here to teach us about her story and what she learned from it, and how she took that situation and turned it into a positive thing in order to create better disability coverage for physicians and advocate for us going forward. Dr. Pearson, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Please tell us about your journey and what happened to you.
I was a practicing OBGYN, and I got called to do a precipitous delivery. Unfortunately, my patient, who I adored, was unable to get her epidural in time. And it's called labor, not a walk in the park. And unfortunately, as I was helping to guide the baby out, I was actually kicked twice.
Oh my goodness.
So the first kick came right to my brachial plexus. My arm went numb. I started to cry. I thought I was doing myself a favor by twisting. Unfortunately, as I got the baby's widest part of its abdomen out, I actually got kicked across my shoulder, and 2 nurses got pushed against the wall.
Oh my goodness.
I ended up with a torn labrum. I was able to complete the delivery. Mommy and baby are fine. I would do it again if I had to. Unfortunately, I did not heal well. I developed a frozen shoulder and went to sleep getting told that I'd be back to work in 12 weeks. And unfortunately, August 3rd of this year was my 10-year anniversary away from clinical medicine.
Oh my goodness.
And I learned a lot the hard way about disability and life insurance. And because I felt like I had not been properly educated or advocated for, I really became very passionate about the topic. And I started learning everything I could. And I was starting to lecture to area residency programs.
Mm-hmm.
And people started asking for my help. And that was when the idea of starting a company and starting the next chapter of my life was born.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for what you did. I know your patient appreciates it, and I know that baby is going to be thankful to you for a long time. And unfortunately, getting injured on the job is a reality of our profession. It could happen to any of us. We spend so much time training for our profession, but sometimes, things like this can get in our way. Can you tell us about what the process was like for the disability insurance claim for you?
Sure. It had lots of hiccups. First thing was my workman's comp claim got initially denied. Mm-hmm. They said that while an injury happened, my frozen shoulder was either idiopathic or my fault because I continued to work while I was injured.
Because that's what we do.
Yeah. Right? And I had to sue the state, 14 months, 3 court appearances. And one of those court appearances, a vocational specialist said that I could be a billing secretary because I had the aptitude to learn codes. Nothing against secretaries or any of our ancillary staff. That is not what I went to med school and got through residency for. And at that moment, I kind of decompensated. And we settled because I needed to get my head out of where it was. So that was one piece. I found out the hard way that our hospital group disability benefit in fine print didn't cover work-related injuries. Wow. So I was flatly denied and told I would have been better off had I fallen off my bike.
Wow.
So not a contract talk, but please know what's in your contract when you become an attending. And then I had 2 private disability policies and found out that really neither of them were exactly what I thought I had. Glad that we had it. Didn't have to sell our house. Didn't have to pull my kids out of school. But I felt at that time very uneducated, and that I kind of didn't know what I didn't know, which we find is a common thread with insurance historically and physicians.
Sure.
And I really made it my mission to not have another physician feel the way that I felt or have the experience that I had.
Absolutely. So please tell us what we don't know about how disability insurance can actually help us protect our career.
So most of us learn, you insure your car, you insure your health, you insure your apartment or your house, right?
Right.
Some of us insure jewelry, right?
Sure.
What we're not taught is that we need to insure our biggest asset. That's our ability to make money.
Our future income.
Right? It's our future income.
Right.
And what disability insurance is doing is protecting that part of our lives that so often gets overlooked, or there's this assumption in medicine that we're better than, stronger than, more resilient than, it's not going to happen to me, right? I talk a lot about the tyranny of perfection in medicine. That really has to change.
Sure. We're all human.
Exactly. And ultimately, obtaining and securing a good disability policy is going to protect your future ability to make money.
Absolutely. And it's not just us. If we have our families in the picture too, how does disability insurance help protect our family's future?
So there's a couple ways that it helps our families. So ultimately, we're talking about money, right? So we're helping to secure the financial life that we thought we were going to have. A piece that also I think gets overlooked is that knowing that you have that financial stability allows you time and space to heal, whether that's physically, mentally, emotionally, right? Is you take one piece of that horribleness and put it up on a shelf, right? I don't have to at least worry about that. And it allows you to focus on the important things, right? And so I would say that, again, while the biggest protection is financial, I think the human side of it and the ability to recover is just as, if not more important. Absolutely.
And if we get injured, we don't have to take our kids out of school or private school or move to a different house and change schools. It can ensure that stability for them despite what's going on for us.
Exactly.
So, when we do get injured, we also have a lot of medical bills and, of course, doctor's visits that we will have to pay for if it happens. How does disability insurance help us with that?
So when we're looking at kind of being injured or sick, right? Because the goal with disability insurance is to cover you in case due to injury or illness, right? We can't do our jobs.
Right.
Most of the time, we're going to have health insurance to cover doctor's bills. Right. The issue becomes in the event I was terminated, right? My FMLA, the day my FMLA was up, I got terminated.
Oh my goodness.
My contract said I had to be able to do 100% of my job. I couldn't do 100% of my job. At a certain point, you lose your health insurance if you're an employed physician. So a little bit different if you're a 1099 or a K1, if you're private and you're already purchasing your own health insurance. But this was able to kind of make our segue. Now, I went right on my husband's health insurance.
That was fortunate.
But sometimes if somebody's single, if they have a partner that doesn't have good benefits, they have to go to COBRA. COBRA's expensive. There is a carrier that will help with COBRA payments. And that specific piece, super sexy in the right house, doesn't mean anything in another house.
Right.
And so that kind of ties back into you really want to make sure you're getting properly educated.
Sure. Yeah. And that's why having a good broker that knows the ins and outs of that
Right.
really helps.
And then also might I add that I have found in speaking to a lot of disabled physicians that no matter what, there are unforeseen costs, things that you just never think about. And at least I can say personally, the way that our kitchen was designed, I couldn't get into certain cabinets. I couldn't take things out of the oven.
Sure, you had a shoulder injury.
And I had a shoulder. It wasn't working.
Right.
And because of that, I had to hire help in my house. I had to get a mother's helper assistant. And we have big dogs. Actually, one of them I credit with saving my life. We can talk about that later. But,
I want to hear the story.
She's big. And then we added a second big dog.
Right.
And I couldn't chance getting my right arm injured walking two big dogs. And I certainly couldn't hold them with my left. And so I had to hire a dog walker, right? Like these are weird. I mean, I think weird.
Things you wouldn't think about.
Things that you just wouldn't think about.
Absolutely.
And everyone has their own story. And so, I like to think that having disability insurance in place and having that money coming in allows you to be able to do some of that stuff.
Right. So, being physicians, we often have high incomes and a quality of life standard of living that needs to be or should ideally be maintained. So how does disability insurance help us with that quality of life piece?
So with a good private policy, right, one of the hallmarks for me, I would say the two most important things. One is having the right language, and I know we'll talk about that in a little bit. But to me, the second most important thing is the ability to get more coverage without having to go through additional medical underwriting. So everyone, when they get their first policy, has to go through medical underwriting, may have to give up some body fluids, right?
Right.
Definitely have to answer a million medical questions a million times. And these carriers have access to everything. Medical records, pharmaceutical records, motor vehicle records, right? The goal is get one policy when you're young and healthy. And then moving forward, every carrier has what I like to call the pool of money. So there's money sitting somewhere that as your income ascends, if you change jobs and have a different group benefit, that we can capitalize or obtain additional coverage by only giving proof of income. The goal is once you share medical stuff, you don't ever want to have to share it again.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good to know that you can just upgrade a little bit if you need to as you go along without the full medical exam.
And that is part of the service side that brokers and agents, in my opinion, should be doing, is that follow-up, right? Making sure as people change jobs, as people move, that we're doing the right thing and keeping pace with people's incomes. It was a big mistake I made. I threw away snail mail. Now it's a little bit different. We do things, computers,
now
phones.
We just trash the emails.
Right, now we trash the emails. But I never took advantage of that piece. And when I got hurt, I was actually really underinsured.
I see. That's a good reminder. Thank you. Well, physicians in training generally have a lot of student loans after their training. And a lot of us are still carrying that around. What happens to those student loans? And are there any provisions in disability policies that might help us make those payments if we're disabled?
So the first part of that is I feel like student loan repayment is changing all the time. Right? Kind of depends who's in office and whether things can get discharged.
Right.
Not.
Yeah.
In the situation that I was in, my student loans didn't go away. We still had to pay them. Now, there are a couple of disability insurance carriers who offer a student loan repayment rider.
Okay.
Completely honestly, I mean, you know, I'm honest to a fault. I don't usually recommend it. The reason is twofold. One, it's a really expensive rider. And the second thing, which I didn't learn until I started doing this, is that it's actually a term rider. So while your overall policy should be covering you until a certain age, usually 65 or 67, the student loan rider is only good for the 5 or 10 years that you buy the policy.
So the term starts when you buy the policy,
Yes.
not when you get disabled.
Correct.
How interesting.
Which is very interesting. And again, I didn't learn it till I was in it.
Yeah.
And if you look at actuarial data, most physicians go out on a claim 10 plus years into practice.
Interesting.
And so I tend to recommend that people put money in an emergency fund, in an interest-bearing account, in the hopes that should something happen to you, you have some money set aside.
Thankfully, the government is making it easier to get disability discharge now,
Yes.
where it wasn't so easy before.
Yeah.
So that's good to know. So and a lot of us, you know, being in medicine, we practice different types of medicine. I'm a primary care. I don't do any surgery. And then, you know, there might be super specialists out there listening to this conversation. So how can we all protect our own specialized skills and ensure that?
So every insurance carrier has an internal dialogue where we all get put into what's called an occupational class.
Okay.
So they may not be the same carrier to carrier, but it's their internal risk stratification. And so the definition for specialty specific, and I say specialty specific instead of own occupation because there are multiple phrases used that mean the same thing, but you're covered for what it is you do day in and day out. And that matters really at 2 times in the life of a policy. When you purchase the policy, because it helps really with cost. When it really matters is at the time of a claim. The carriers are going to look back about 1 to 3 years, and they're going to look at your calendar, your ICD codes. How do you make money?
Okay.
Right? And a lot of us change over the course of our career. So you do want to be covered for what it is you do and how you make money when the time, if the time comes that you can't do that anymore. And so the companies kind of take care of that for us.
Okay, so what keywords do we want to be looking at for that policy?
So I always tell people the biggest concern for me is there's no standardization of language in insurance.
Yeah.
And so, you know, going back when I said I talk about specialty specific, it goes by own occupation, true own occupation, regular occupation, pure own occupation. So each carrier has their own phrasing. You want to make sure that anybody who's teaching you about a product that you're going to purchase, that there is something in there that makes it a truly specialty specific policy. And the caveat to that is not only by the definition of your occupation, but by the definition of total disability. And what I mean by that is there are some policies out there that are specialty specific for what you do, but then when you look at how they define total disability, it may be that, you know, in the beginning for the first, 2 or 3 years, it's own occupation, specialty specific, and then it may switch to any occupation. Or the way that they define total disability may be that you're considered totally disabled if you can't do your job and you're not gainfully employed.
Interesting.
And that definition stinks for most of us. What you want the policy to say is that you're considered totally disabled if you can't do your job, regardless if you're gainfully employed in another occupation.
Sure. Most of us don't want to just sit around. We're productive people by nature, and we want to continue to do something.
Correct.
But it's important to have that coverage for what we can't do anymore.
Correct.
Well, going through the disability process can be pretty emotionally harrowing, as you alluded to. How do we make sure that our mental health needs get covered in this process?
So, mental health is an interesting topic. The coverage on these private policies has actually changed a lot in the last decade. And I would say even more recently, in May of this year, a couple of carriers changed.
Interesting.
It used to be really hard for physicians to get mental health coverage. Now, most of the carriers will give you a choice. So you can have full coverage for the life of the policy, but expect to pay more.
Okay.
Or you can opt for a 1 or 2 year benefit, and that often comes with a discount. Now, the caveat to that is by the time many of us are in training, we've already gotten a diagnosis.
Right. Which medical student isn't anxious,
right,
or depressed?
And so I tell people, look, your mental health is what's important. I don't have the data to back this up. My gut says that if we are seeking care, if we are taking medication, if we're being followed appropriately, that shouldn't be why we go out. And I always tell people, look, at the end of the day, look at your support network, right? There's definitely a financial incentive if you don't have a strong family history, if you would seek care if you needed it, right? That you would want that full coverage or not. Again, my personal story, it was actually the only question I asked because my mom happened to be a very poorly controlled bipolar sufferer, and I was panicked that that was going to be my fate. And back in the early 2000s, there were only 2 carriers that would give OBGYNs full coverage. So I only looked at those 2, and it was the only question I asked. But again, it is definitely an individual process.
Sure. And
you want to make sure that you're seeing, or at least talking about, what your options are.
Yeah. So yeah, not only is it a mentally demanding job, it's also a very physically demanding job. Most of us, what we do is very physically demanding. How can we help stave that off?
That's almost a separate kind of idea, in that the number one reason that physicians go out is musculoskeletal disease.
Right.
Right. So staving it off would involve ergonomic training,
right,
which I think should be done. We know a lot of proceduralists, a lot of the instrumentation was developed for bigger hands than maybe some of us have.
Right.
Right. Lead in the IR suite, right? Usually not designed for smaller women, right? And so there's also a preventative piece, but knowing that that is our number one reason for going out is more reason to get it when you're young and healthy, right? Before something happens.
Right.
Right. The calls I get upset with are the ones where something happened, last week, and now I need this. And I'm like, okay, we'll do the best we can, but they're not going to cover that. Right. And they may even want to wait to see how that heals. Right.
Right.
And so I think the most important thing is to get this stuff when you're as young and healthy as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. When we have less things that would drive up the rate or
lead to an exclusion or something that they're not going to cover.
Right. Absolutely. So you mentioned how your employer coverage was somewhat inadequate in in covering you. Tell us a little bit more about why employer coverage we get. We all get this. If we are employees, generally, most contracts will include a disability insurance benefit. Tell us about why that's not adequate.
So there are three big things that I tend to focus on when I'm comparing group benefits to private benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So number one is taxation. And a lot of people don't realize that if your group employer benefit is paid for by your employer, which is the overwhelming majority of cases, any money that you would get from that is actually taxable because your employer is paying with pre-tax dollars.
Got it.
Okay. If it's an employer, but you have to pay for it. So sometimes there are employee paid employer policies.
Okay.
It would be tax-free.
Okay.
So like everything in medicine, there's exceptions.
Sure.
The second thing we often talk about is ownership. So you have a group policy by your employer. You have no control over it, right? You don't help create it. You don't get to change it. And for the most part, you don't get to keep it.
Right.
Most of the time, they're employer dependent. So once you decide to leave,
all of a sudden you're not covered.
Now you're not covered. And I get a ton of those calls, right? And then the biggest thing is language, which I touched on previously. Most employer policies will have a limitation on the own OC or specialty specific piece. 99.9% of them will define total disability as the inability to do your job and not be gainfully employed. And so they're not going to have to pay you as much if you decide to be productive, right? And then they've gotten really good at kind of sneaking stuff in. I told you about my policy. We're actually seeing more and more of that since COVID. And disturbingly, we're seeing where the policies in fine print will say they're not covering work-related injuries or illnesses. I have no idea.
Even COVID?
I have no idea how we are supposed to prove
Wow.
where we got sick from. So I think it's a real slippery slope that's happening. And a lot of the policies will now limit for things like musculoskeletal events, for mental health events, and even more interestingly is what's being called subjective illnesses. So think of the things that don't have pathognomonic tests, right? Not every migraine sufferer is going to have a positive scan, right? And so they've created this list, which is, including but not limited to pain, headaches, ringing in the ears, repetitive motion issues. There's a whole list. It's like as long as my arm, where they'll only pay for 2 years.
Wow.
And there are a lot of things that don't have a positive test.
Right.
And so it's really important to get your eyes on the actual policy. It's often one line on our open enrollment packet. You check a box and you move on. And you just don't know what you don't know.
Right. Most of the time, we don't get the actual policy in front of us.
And the biggest issue is oftentimes people don't know how much they're actually getting covered. A lot of times it's a percentage up to a maximum benefit. And oftentimes it's only a percentage of your base salary. And we know a lot of people, especially in academic tertiary care centers, their total income is actually broken down into multiple buckets.
Yeah, more and more we're RVU driven.
Right. And so oftentimes someone will tell me what they think they have covered. And then I point out the particulars, and it's not a very enviable position to be in, to tell somebody that what they think is not reality.
What's the typical coverage? What percentage of our pay can we expect to get in the best disability insurance policy?
In the best case scenario, we're trying to get as close to 60 to 70-ish% of your take home pay. Very infrequently, and again, there's exceptions to every rule, it's really hard to be made whole. There has to be a theoretical incentive for people to get back to work.
Sure.
So it's super hard to be 100% covered, right?
Right.
Sometimes that changes when somebody changes a job and changes their group benefit. But for the most part, that's the goal. Now, different in training. So part of the reason we like physicians to do it in training is everybody qualifies for the same amount of coverage. They're not actually looking at how much money you make or what benefits you have. And oftentimes for residents, we can get them totally insured or even a little overinsured. And then as you go into transition into attendinghood, there are different times where we would talk about increasing coverage.
Okay. So what about self-employed doctors or the rare doctor that actually owns their own practice? How does their disability insurance coverage differ or their needs differ?
So there's a couple things. One is what would happen if you became disabled, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are some private docs who will say to me, look, if something happens to me, I'm closing the doors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then I'm really focused on replacing their income.
Right.
There's actually another type of insurance called business overhead insurance that is primarily for business owners. So if you were to say to me, look, I have a panel of patients, I have other employees, I want to keep the doors open.
Mm-hmm.
What business overhead insurance will protect is the day-to-day operations. So it'll cover, do you need to hire locums? It'll cover rent. It'll cover paying your staff. And so the calculations are a little bit different, but there is a way that that owner can feel protected, that their whole practice isn't going to crumble.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good to know. We have that much coverage.
Yep.
So can you tell us a little bit about roadblocks or key challenges that people encounter when they're trying to get their own occupation disability
Absolutely.
insurance?
So there are a few that we run into more often than others. And this also comes into kind of how much information, right, we're getting up front.
Right.
I would say some of the big ones, one, and I'm surprised how many people write their own prescriptions or have their friends write them. You know, I know, been there, done that. And we're not talking about, I'm on call, I have a UTI, please call me in an antibiotic.
Right.
Right. We're talking about psych meds, pain meds, sleeping aids, weight loss drugs.
Oh, yeah.
I actually have had a couple people who have written their own infertility drugs.
Ooh.
I don't recommend that.
Yeah.
Please, if you are writing your own prescriptions, stop. The carriers want 2 years of good behavior, right? So that means you're seeing a treating doc. That doc is writing your prescriptions. You're getting follow-up care as needed.
Being a good patient.
Being a good patient and not being a doctor heal thyself. It's one of the few things that actually makes people uninsurable. I always joke, kind of, sort of, if a friend asks you to write a prescription, the first thing you should ask them is if they have a DI policy. And I say it a little tongue-in-cheek, but if your friend is asking you to write the prescription, you're actually doing them a favor, because there has to be a paper trail of medications. So you're not going to get jammed up, but they're going to get jammed up when it pops up in a medication search and they call your office and your office doesn't have them as a patient, right? Because you've just done them a favor.
Right.
Honestly, if they already have a policy in place, it may not be best practice, but you're not going to jam them up.
Okay. Good to know. Well, burnout is a big deal these days in the physician world. Does disability insurance help us with any kind of coverage if we are burned out for mental health needs?
So that goes back to the mental health coverage
Yeah.
conversation.
Right.
And so if you purchase a policy without any diagnosis, yes, you can have mental health coverage, right? If you've already have a diagnosis, they're not going to cover that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the burnout piece, it's more of a kind of front-ended how we're protected. Oftentimes, once we're there, we may not be able to get that covered. I would say one of the things that it helps, and I'm not sure if it's really related to burnout or not, is going back to the first thing I said, where knowing that you have money coming in for an injury or illness can at least allow you some space to work on your mental health and your physical health.
Right.
But the short answer to that question is it matters what's going on when you purchase your policy. So it goes back to you really want to get it when you're young and healthy.
Got it. What about women in particular? We go through childbearing and end up usually, racking up the diagnoses around that
Which
time.
is another big roadblock.
Right.
I will often tell women specifically that you need to get disability insurance before the first time you try to get pregnant. The companies really try to find reasons not to cover future pregnancies. So we know that data has definitely shown that women who put off family planning for education, for career, have higher instances of miscarriage and the need for assisted reproductive technology.
Right.
And so if you've had a miscarriage in the 12 months leading up to an application, they're not going to cover future pregnancy.
Wow.
If you've had an abnormal outcome, so gestational diabetes, postpartum hemorrhage, there's just so many things that happen that they're looking for not covering. If you see REI, right? So you go to an infertility specialist. If the word infertility is already in your GYN chart, they're not going to cover infertility. They may not cover infertility or pregnancy.
Wow.
One of the feathers in my cap is when I started doing this, any woman that had a C-section for any reason didn't have future pregnancies covered. I happened to make breech babies, and it's standard of care in the United States to have a C-section, right? And so I started sending white papers, and I was talking about, women not being allowed to VBAC in hospitals, not being able to have vaginal twins, not all the things.
Right.
And I'm happy to say that over the course of time, we have had all of the carriers at least be willing to look at why you had a section, and they might change the language to not covering future complications of a C-section, which is very different than not covering pregnancy.
Wow.
So
that's amazing.
Unfortunately, one of them swung back last year. But that means that if I'm speaking to somebody who's had a section, I may not recommend that company.
Sure.
Right? Because
would make sense.
I am, above all else, still a women's health, advocate. So women absolutely, and just as a little plug for life insurance, gestational diabetes can as much as double to quadruple a woman's cost for life insurance. So all women should get at least their first life insurance policy in place before they get pregnant.
All right. Lots of planning to do there.
Yes.
Well, what about weight loss drugs like Ozempic? What if someone goes on Ozempic? Then what happens to their disability coverage or how much they pay for their disability?
So the carriers really don't know what to do yet with a lot of these newer kind of end-all be-all meds. So I would say broadly, most people on weight loss meds are being treated like they're diabetics.
Oh.
And they look at they might limit the benefit period, they might increase the cost. There's a lot of issues. They've never been very easy to deal with weight loss.
Mhm.
Pretty much if you've lost weight, if you haven't kept it off for a year, they add half of it back. And it's one of the few things that changes the cost. So a lot of times it's just, we're not going to cover this, right? We're going to cover you from head to toe, but you broke your ankle last year. We're not covering your ankle. It's not going to make it more expensive.
I see.
BMI is one of the few things that will actually change the cost. And a lot of the carriers really don't know what to do with these meds. So again, it's going back to better to get your policy before you start these meds. And they're going to be looking in your medical records as far as what do your records say, right?
Right.
Is it for weight loss? Is it for pre-diabetics? And so I think this is going to be a very interesting, evolving space over the next couple of years.
Well, at least that's a little bit easier to plan for.
Yes.
You could just get the disability insurance on the front end and then start the Ozempic.
Yes. Because even if you would get an increase in cost, say because you have an elevated BMI, most of the carriers are willing to what's called reconsider. So once you lose the weight and keep it off, we can usually get that rating removed, as opposed to coming in on the medication and now there's all these hoops that you have to jump through. It makes it a little bit harder.
So what are some other things that affect the cost of policies?
So lots of things go into cost. Kind of the easiest list is, are you a boy or a girl? Unfortunately, it is more expensive for women than it is for men. Life insurance is the opposite, more expensive for men than women.
At least it's even.
It's not entirely as sexist as it appears. It's based on true actuarial data. Historically, across all fields, more women leave the workforce because of injury or illness. Men tend to die younger and more successfully by their own hands. And so that is where the cost gradient comes from. Once you take that into account, age, so younger, cheaper.
Okay.
What do you do? So it shouldn't come as a surprise that a psychiatrist may be cheaper to insure than a cardiothoracic surgeon, right? And so remember, I talked about occupational class.
Right.
So occupational class goes into cost. The state where you live or where you practice, and I say that or because some carriers look at where you practice, some look at where you live. Some states happen to be more expensive. Florida, Texas, California, New York, kind of what you would expect. Interestingly, Vermont, I'm not sure why, but it is. So where you live, and then it's some of your history. So there are some medical conditions that automatically, when I hear it, I'm like, okay, you're going to pay more, right? And so history comes into account, but not most of the time by cost. Because remember, most of the time it's just, we're not going to cover this thing.
Got it.
But some of them do incur an increased cost.
So anyway, we can get a discount. I love a good discount.
So in training, yes.
Okay.
Most of our training programs have an associated discount just because you're in training. And once you lock that in, it's locked in.
Nice.
So it's a huge reason. I mean, we're talking savings of thousands, and I'm a little sadistic. After I got hurt, I ran my numbers because I didn't get it as a resident because I wasn't educated. And so I got it as a first year attending. I qualified for less because now as an attending, remember when I said in training, everybody qualifies for the same thing.
Sure.
Outside of training, there's an internal algorithm that looks at how much money do you make? What benefits do you have? Who's paying for them? And the company says, here's what we'll cover you for. It's not like you can say to me, Steph, I want $20,000 a month in benefit. I'm willing to pay for it. I can't make that happen. And I found very disturbing that I would have qualified for more and paid less if I'd gotten it as a resident than I did literally my first year as an attending.
Wow.
So super, super important. There are some other discounts that we can create, for lack of a better phrase. Sometimes you can have a multi-life discount, where if we can get a certain number of bodies through the same employer, that we can kind of create a discount.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's really hard for attendings to find discounts. They've really done away with, there used to be unisex pricing or gender neutral pricing. Most of the carriers did away with that, I want to say 2019. I don't hold me to that, but I'm thinking that's about when the last carrier did it.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that long ago.
Yeah. Sometimes we can find them in like random places, but for the most part, once you're an attending, getting discounts is really hard.
Got it. Is there anything else about disability insurance that you'd like to cover that we haven't covered yet?
Oh, wow. I would say that when, I talked about a couple of the pieces of the puzzle, making sure that it's specialty specific, making sure that you have the ability to get more later, right? These are called riders. So they're kind of the pieces of the puzzle that create the whole picture.
Right.
And so there are a couple of other riders that we talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Admittedly, some are more important than others for each individual.
Okay.
So there is something called a residual or partial benefit. There are actually more of those filed and paid every year than total.
Interesting.
And what this says is, okay, you can do your job, but it's not sustainable. So I always tell people, think about things that cause fatigue, MS, other autoimmune diseases, early degenerative diseases, trying to work through chemo.
Right.
Just about every breast cancer survivor has tried to go back to work at some point during their recovery. And so I think that one's super, super important. They each have different triggering events, and their definitions are a little bit different. There's something called a catastrophic benefit, which is exactly what it sounds like, shockingly. It's if something really horrible happens and you are left unable to perform 2 or more of your activities of daily living without assistance, or you're severely cognitively impaired, so you need a shadow. And that's an additive benefit. So your monthly benefit and then your catastrophic benefit.
Oh, that's good. Because you'll need caregivers and
Correct.
you'll have more
It's
costs.
for increased healthcare costs
Sure.
and home adjustment costs, right? And then there's a cost of living adjustment, or COLA, which is supposed to be inflationary protection. So dollar today isn't what $1 10 years from now would be.
Right.
The interesting thing, and I think this trips people up a lot, is it kicks in when you go on claim. So you're sick or injured, they're paying you as you hit month 13, 25, 37, your benefit goes up. But if you buy a policy today, and let's just say you have a $10,000 a month benefit and you don't touch it, and then 5 years from now you have an issue, you're getting $10,000 for the first year, right? So I think we're so used to hearing about cost of living adjustments being like year to year,
Mm-hmm.
but very specifically, it kicks in when you go on claim.
How interesting. And you mentioned that disability insurances usually cover us until 65. So what if we live past that? I guess, should we be saving for retirement at the same time?
Yes, a million times. Yes. Most of the companies now will go to 65 or 67. We tend to go to 65, quite honestly, because most of the people I've ever known only want to work until they're 65.
Right.
So I wouldn't necessarily want to pay for coverage beyond that.
Okay.
There's 2 schools of thought. One is that we should all be maxing out our retirement every year. There are a couple of companies that do offer a retirement rider, but they also tend to be really expensive. And I tend to recommend that people throughout their careers are investing appropriately.
Good to know. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pearson, for that insightful discussion. I'm so glad that we have you advocating for us and educating us, because this whole financial world can be quite intimidating, and especially the complications and the little fine print of disability insurance can be hard to read through. So I'm so glad you're here to teach us.
Well, thank you very much. And I am trying to educate everybody. I mean, I won't be happy until every graduating resident has a policy.
Love that. Well, I'd like to open this discussion up to the Q&A now. Please go ahead and submit your questions if you haven't done it already. We have some already here. So how long does the application process take?
If I had a crystal ball, I would not be here. All kidding aside, I would say on average, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks. We've had policies go through in 2 days, and we've had applications take months and months and months. It depends on your medical history. It depends on, what does the carrier need to get. And so the short answer is expect it to take about 4 to 6 weeks.
Okay. Next question. If I'm considering getting disability insurance, what is the best time of year to get it?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure there's a right answer. Typically, we talk about, the younger the better, right? I have found that, a lot of people will wait until right before graduation. I don't really recommend that. We've had residents go out. It's really when you have a little bit of downtime in training, right?
Right.
Do you have an easy rotation? Do you have, like all kidding aside, right?
Right.
You're training, you're not, adulting kind of goes to the wayside, right?
Right.
You're so focused on doctoring and learning and doing. And so I don't think there's necessarily a best time of year. I think it's really what's working for you and when do you have some time to really dedicate to the process.
Okay, fair enough. Next question. Why is it so important to get a policy that is portable?
Okay, so with your private policy, well, I guess I should take a step back. Most of the group policies, remember I talked about, they tend to be employment dependent. So you leave, it stays.
Mm-hmm.
With a private policy, it's yours. You help create it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You control it, you keep it. I say it's like having it in your back pocket. I realize I'm aging myself and everybody has it on their computer, but it's going to go with you wherever you go. And we know that a vast majority of trainees leave, right? And actuarially speaking, the last quote or statistic I saw was that most people will change their employers 3 to 5 times over their working life. And you want a policy to keep going with you.
Right.
So as long as you're in the United States, it's golden. Some of the carriers, you can live in Canada. There's nuances and exclusions to everything, exceptions to everything.
Next question we have come in. Why is it so important to get a policy sooner rather than later?
So, the obvious question or obvious answer is you're never getting younger than you are, right? Currently, most of us don't get healthier, right? And so if we're looking at trying to get the most comprehensive coverage at the lowest cost, right? Sooner the better. Right? Oftentimes, as I mentioned before, I get the call after the fact, right? I just got diagnosed with X, and then I'm stuck, right? It's the before X is when you want to be getting it done. You want to get it done when you least expect it to happen or at least think that you're going to need it, right?
Right.
And then you just forget about it, right? You just set your payments, or you work with a company that reminds you, right?
Right.
And it's just something you don't have to worry about moving forward.
Well, that sounds nice. Next question. Do you have recommendations for someone who is mid-career and has changed jobs? Current employer does not offer any disability insurance, therefore I currently do not have any disability coverage.
So as I spoke about the whole employment dependent, right? So this happens not infrequently, and we just have to play catch up, right? Unfortunately, it's probably going to be a bit more expensive because you're older. And what they'll coverage is going to be predicated by your medical history and your surgical history and what medications you're on, right? So, it's going to be a little bit more expensive, but the way that I kind of tell people is, look, you've won the game thus far, right? And if you think about it from purely being academic and thinking about business, the older you are, the more likely you are to actually go out on claim if we're talking actuarial data, right? So the companies that are selling the product need to make sure that they're risk mitigating appropriately, so that the people that need it on the other end get covered.
That's the end of our questions today. Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time for joining us to learn about this very important coverage. If you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to the PearsonRavitz team. They're here to answer your questions. And please make sure you check your email and you'll get the 10 points of why you should be getting disability insurance sent to you as well. Thank you and have a good night.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Disha, for being part of this.
Thank you for having me.